Where we left off last time, we were looking at form validation. So we started with a failing test. Our failing test was, well, let's run it. It was the transaction command validation test. So let's actually go there. So we'll let that run. So those are all passing now. Basically, we're using the Hibernate implementation of the validator because that's basically what Spring uses. And so we're using this thing called the local validator factory bean to just basically set everything up for us. And so once we have everything set up, we can do things like see if there are any constraint violations if, for example, we set the amount to 0. So yesterday we did a tiny refactoring, technically not a refactoring because we changed the, well, actually it was a refactoring because we did not change the external behavior. What we did was we changed in transaction command. Previously we had amount as a string, and then amount in sense would convert that to an int, right? So remember, we're scaling our amounts by having ints and sort of a fixed decimal point. So 100 would basically be 100 pennies, which is $1. And so previously we just converted the string, and so we can look at what it was before, right? It was just a string amount. The thing is as a string, that's going to be hard to validate. You could do sort of fancy regular expressions, but like, let's just convert it to a big decimal. That helps us anyway because that makes our conversion a tiny bit easier, but certainly makes our the validation a lot easier. So now that we have it as a big decimal, we can use this annotation here, this @positive, and when we say validate this object, it will look at what annotations you have to see if they are, if sort of the value matches that validation. And that's pretty much mainly used in forms. And so what we're going to do next is, now that we have the validation working from a test point of view, we're now going to go into the form and display the messages, right? So if they enter a negative amount, we will display an error message and ask them to try again rather than process it. So our goal here, our story here, is prevent people from putting in 0 or negative amounts for a deposit or a withdraw. And that's really sort of, for a casual application like this, you might say, oh, well, that's not really necessary, but it's good to have, because the last thing I want is, for other people to use this and either intentionally or accidentally type amounts that are negative or 0. So let's also run run the application, so we can remind ourselves what the form looks like. And let's go here. We'll go to localhost. Not ready yet. So we're going to log in as the parent because only the parent has access to deposit and withdraw. So let's go ahead to, oh, I still have to fix up that stuff. Okay, so here's our form. Right now we can type in negative, 100 and say, haha, this is a weird deposit. And as we saw yesterday, we now get a failure. It doesn't even try to process it, because what happens is we're not handling this binding result, what's called this binding result. And the reason why that's happening is because in our deposit controller, we added this valid annotation to our transaction command. So this valid annotation forces or tells Spring to run the validation on this command before calling into this method. Since the validation failed and we didn't provide a way for Spring to tell us this, it basically returned an exception, which, of all things, it's better to have that than allow that input to come in. So what we want to do is we want to basically we want to make it so that from a UI level, if they enter a 0 or a negative amount, we want to see some error message displayed. And so what we'll have to do here is create so I'm trying to think of the test to write here. So the test that we want to write here, I know from a UI level, right, we would do a post to the deposit command. So we would go to our deposit controller test. And this would be an integration test because the validation, if we just used it in our controller test where we're directly calling the controller, these currently pass. I could make a test here that submitted a negative amount, and this would still pass because that valid annotation would not be triggered by calling the controller directly. That valid annotation is only going to be called if we process it through Spring. So that means it's going to be an integration test. So if we do our deposit integration test, this is the one we want. We're logged in as parent, and so what we want to do is we want to have a test where let's see, submit negative amount should display error message. So something like that. And so the end result that we want is somehow, and we probably won't use an assert that, the end result that we want is that there are going to be errors on the page. So if we do a mock MVC and we do a perform and we do a post to deposit and we say our amount is negative $11.23 for some strange reason. The date we're not validating yet. We might want to validate the date. Not sure that we need to validate. I'm just thinking, will we need to validate that? I don't think so. So I can put in any date. I'll put in, 2018. Let's say September 25th. Coming up with random information is fun. Description. This shouldn't be allowed. Okay, and then we want to expect. So what we're expecting here is that the model has errors. So if you recall, the way Spring MVC works is there's this model idea, and that's what's used by Thymeleaf or other view technologies to basically fill in the information. Hey Alex, welcome back. To fill in the information, and what we want to check is that the model has returned errors when we supply a negative value. We can be a little bit more specific about what kind of error, but this should be sufficient. And that's it for this test. So this test will hopefully fail because we haven't implemented any code to make it pass. Let's see. Yeah, so this is running. We're logged in as parents, so we're allowed to access the deposit form, so that won't be a problem. The amount is negative, and the idea is we want to have an error for that. We are running validation. Oh, actually, well, so this will be interesting. So the model may not have errors, but it will definitely throw an exception. And we will get, I guess, a 400 error code. So it failed, but it'll fail for the wrong reason. Yeah, so it failed because there was no model and view. The reason why is Spring abandoned creating any kind of model because it said, I can't validate this transaction command, exception thrown, and boom. So that's good. It failed in an expected way. And this is something I harp on a lot, is that when you're doing test-driven development, it's not only important that the test fails first, but that it fails in a way that makes sense, that it fails in an expected way. If it failed because it actually had a model with no errors, I might be a bit surprised. If it failed in some other way, I would be surprised as well. And so my goal is to, when my test fails, is that's just more information. As long as it fails in an expected way, I'm happy. If it fails in an unexpected way, I don't want to be surprised. So if I'm surprised, then there's something else going on. So this meets our expectations. And so now what we want to do is we want to actually cause errors to happen. What we could do is we could see what happens if we take the, no, not here. If we go to the deposit controller and see what happens if we take out this valid command and then run the test again. So in this case, it will fail, but it will fail for a different reason. So it will fail because, actually in this case, there might not be a model. Because we're not creating a model here. We're actually just doing a redirect. So what do we want to do? So we'll basically want to redirect them back to the deposit form. So let's see. So how did this fail? This failed because we basically got a 302. Yeah. So here, so this is a slightly different error message. Here we expected binding validation errors, and because we took off the valid, we didn't get any. But with the valid on, there was no place to put these binding errors. And the terminology binding here is basically goes way back to kind of the whole point of MVC is it binds the stuff in the form object that comes in. It binds that to our DTO, and so that's why it's called a binding error. All right, so let's put the valid back in here, and what we want to do is we want to pass in what's called a binding result. And let's put this on a new line. Actually, let's put that on a new line. And so now we have a binding result. And if we look at the docs for this, basically it basically holds on to the problems, the errors that would occur. And yeah, this is pretty old. This goes back to Spring 2. Okay, so what we want to do is inside of our code, here we're going to process the deposit, but we don't want to do that if there are errors. And so let's run the test now and see, since we get the valid, but we have the binding results, will that change the behavior of the test? Because my expectation is that previously, when we got this, it basically was saying there was a binding result, but it had no place to put that error. Okay. So this is sort of the downside of I'm getting a compile error because in one of my tests I'm calling the process deposit command directly. I've now changed it to add a place for the binding result. For now, I can pass in null. We'll see though that that's going to cause problems later. Let me just run this test. So this test should still pass, but we'll see later when we actually use that binding result that it's going to fail. Okay, so that passed. Sorry, that passes. Let's go back and we wanted to run. Where was it? This integration test. So let's go back here and run this one. That was what we were trying to run. Okay, so it fails, which is good. And okay, so basically now, so notice that we're getting the same kind of error that we were getting when we didn't validate. Now we have a valid annotation, but we also have a place to put that. Let's actually run. Let's go back to the application and see what happens. Oops. Go to deposit money. Why are we not able? I wonder if there's deposit money 404. Oh, there's some error page. Okay, that's probably because there's a form in flight. So let's restart the app. Because what I want to see is what happens if, so we now have the valid, but we also have the binding results. So there's a place for Spring to put the errors that we're currently just ignoring. So will we go back to the behavior of figuring out, of Spring just following through and continuing to call the post, or will it give us that error page again? Okay, so we're up and running. So we're here, 100. Yeah. So this is what I expected, right? So we were getting an error page before because there was no place for Spring to sort of deposit these binding results. And so Spring is figuring if you don't have this in your method signature, Spring has no way to communicate that there was a problem. So it doesn't even call your method at all. It basically throws an exception. Now that we've provided this binding result here, Spring has a place to hand you the results of that validation. And like now Spring is saying, now it's your job to figure out what to do with that. We ignored it, which we don't want to do anymore. But at least now we're at the place where we can see that we need to process this binding result. So from a test point of view, we are expecting there to be errors. Right. The great thing about being I mentioned this on Twitter the other day, the great thing that the advantage sort of that I have as a Java trainer where I go into companies and I teach this stuff is I make good learning materials and I keep them up to date. So I basically can refer back to them when I need to figure out what to do and if I haven't done it for a while. So even though I've been doing this stuff for many years, I don't remember every little detail because I haven't used it recently. So what we want to do is basically examine the binding result. So the binding result has a method called hasErrors. And that's basically true or false. So if it has errors, we want to do an early return. What we want to do is we want to basically return the deposit view. So here we're saying if there are errors, don't bother going any further. Basically re-display the deposit form and let the deposit form pull the errors out of the binding result. So right now what will happen, I think, is that our test will pass because now there will be errors in the model. I don't think we have to put them, yeah. So let's see. So we're not displaying the errors on the form yet. We're just basically returning bad binding results. So let's run this test. So this is the test where we're checking the model for errors. That's basically this test. So now we expect the model to have errors because we have we've looked at the binding result. There are errors. That should automatically be put in the model, and we're returning back to the form. And I think this should work. If not, I've learned something. Oh, okay. So it failed. Let's see. It failed because of Thymeleaf stuff. What did I forget? Neither binding result nor plain target object for bean name deposit available as a request attribute. So it's saying on the deposit template, all right, so I've forgotten to do something. Again, it's been a while since I've done form validation, and I've forgotten the right way to do it. All right, so let's go look at at the Thymeleaf docs. because I have forgotten how to do that. So here on Thymeleaf plus Spring, we want validation error messages. That's what we want. So field errors, all errors, global errors, displaying errors outside forms. But that doesn't tell me what my controller needs to do. So let's see. So this tells us how to do that. Maybe it's more of a Spring MVC thing. So let's look at our Spring, our docs. Spring, and we want the Spring MVC docs. Where are the docs? Why are you hiding the docs? I see projects and guides. Why are you hiding the docs? I guess we could just look at the Spring guides. They're generally okay. Although the security one that I was looking at was a bit overmuch. So what do? They basically, right, so they have validation on their stuff. They created a web controller. So the post mapping, right, they have a valid, they have the binding result just like we have. And they just have the format. So what do we have here? Yeah, so we're pretty much doing that. And we have that. So what actually is the problem here? The art of reading stack traces. So what I'm looking for is a cause. So neither binding result nor plain target object for deposit is available as a request. So is it saying that I don't have a transaction command here? Because the example here basically they do this funky why does it implement it? Oh, I see there. Okay. So that's not helpful. Spring MVC binding result get mapping post mapping. So what's this example? That's just the get. So the get mapping, why are they doing a validation on a get? That is weird. Yeah, don't do that. Don't submit data on a get. That's just bad. So that's model attribute. I'm sure it's something stupid that I'm not seeing. That's not helpful. We looked at that guide. All right, let's look at the docs. So we want binding result. Let's So this goes to appointments new, which returns a new appointment form. So this is basically similar to what we're doing. It's a post method where we're doing a valid on the object. We have a binary result. If it has errors, here it's redirecting to appointments new, which basically takes it to this get method, which gets the form. Need a binding result. Do I have to do a redirect? No, it's not a redirect. So what happens is when I return deposit, that means the browser will do a get on /deposit, which will map to here. This takes in a model, adds attribute, wonder if it's getting confused. Boy, I didn't think I'd get stuck on this part. There's clearly something that I am missing. All right, let's search for this error message. So what does this person say? Oh, okay. Well, so that's why I probably haven't run into this before, because I think that was a change in Spring Framework 5, because this used to work. So what is the change that's required? So in addition to valid, it needs the model attribute of the object. That's interesting. Because as I've mentioned before, like I've been usually using Spring Boot 1.5, which is based on Spring Framework 4. So apparently there's been some change. So what it's suggesting. Well, now I guess the error message makes a bit more sense. So here, this name deposit command, it can't find the deposit object that represents that. I'm not sure why it needs that, but alrighty. So let's do this. Let's put in valid, and this is model attribute, and we call this deposit. I wonder if... So my naming here might not be great anyway, because I've got deposit as the name of the deposit command inside of the form, and I've got deposit that's the name of the view. And even though that may be okay, I'm starting to get a little bit confused. So let's do this. Let's I don't want to rename this just yet. Let's see if this fixes it. So we basically tagged the model attribute for this thing. Let's see if that fixes it. But I think I'm going to want to rename this this attribute here as deposit command, because that's what it really is. And that way we separate out the deposit view name and the deposit command object. And I bet if we call this deposit command, like deposit command like this, that might work better. But let's let this test run and see where we are. Yeah, okay, that's really annoying. I wonder if that's in the Spring Boot migration guide. Let me take a look. So, Spring MVC migration guide. That's upgrading to 5.1. I want upgrading to 5.0. So removed, commons logging, cores, dropped support. Hallelujah, they had dropped support for portlets. Please don't do portlets anymore, though. They haven't been around forever. So nothing there. That's interesting. Nothing specific. I wonder if there's another guide somewhere else. Content negotiation, forwarded headers, builder factory, multi-part and query values, HTTP options. Well, I don't see any mention of anything. So now I don't feel so bad for having made that mistake. Okay. Let's take a quick break. And when we come back, now that this test is passing, we can be a bit more specific about what we're looking for in the errors that we want from the page. Because right now we just said, does the model have errors? If so, we want to actually be a little bit more specific about where those errors are on the page. Because we'll find that right now, even though we have it now in the model, we don't have anything in our template that basically displays those errors. So that's our next step. All right, so I'm going to take a quick break, and we'll come back and work on displaying those error messages. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, this test now passes. Let's see if we can be a bit more specific. So what we expect is, besides the fact that we're going to get a model with errors, I think we also expect that we will get redirected. Come on, line up those darned dots. So we expect that we will get a redirected URL to deposit. I expect this to pass. So let's run that. And I think before I move forward, I want to make that change that I was mentioning before, which is make it a bit more clear in the controller here that this is a deposit command. And even though it's not required, I've seen things basically run a little bit more smoothly when the name of the attribute matches not the name of the variable necessarily. Like Spring, if I don't specify this string, it will actually pull it from the class name. Although that's transaction command, which does not match the deposit command. But let's just be more consistent. So we're calling this deposit command. And if we're worried about consistency, I could make this a constant. But this class is pretty small. It's used in 2 places, so I'm not going to be too particular about it. So that failed. Oh. Where did we end up? Oh, we got a 200. Oh, I guess we weren't redirected. We were just basically having the form reloaded. Okay, that's useful information. See, tests, even when they fail, provide us with information. So I don't know that this is relevant anyway. I don't think we really care. That was sort of me being perhaps a bit overzealous. Okay. What we're really interested in is, besides the fact that the model has errors, we want to actually see those error messages in the form. So what we can do is we can further examine the model. And expect the model attribute has field errors. Lots of choices here. So attribute has errors tells us what? Come on. Darn you. Assert the given, well, that's not helpful. This is like the worst kind of Java doc, right? The method is called attribute has errors, and the documentation says assert the given model attributes have errors. Really? All right. I'm not quite sure what I want to assert here. So let's look at what the assert attribute has errors. What are these names? Are these the names of the attributes? Assert the given model attributes have errors. Okay, so then this would be, we want to indicate that there's an error on amount. This should pass because we don't have to do anything. What's nice about the validation framework, all of us will see that the message itself may not be useful always. Is it automatically knows that amount is the one with the problem because that's the one we had the @valid tag on, right? So it knows it's going to validate this, and if it fails to validate, it knows that it's on this thing, and it knows how to bind that with as the attribute. So what we're saying is that the model has errors and that this specific attribute has errors. None of the other ones do. We could sort of make this fail by saying the model attribute has errors. And basically put it on date, and that should fail. Right, we expect this one, we don't expect this one. Oh, there's that error. So see this semicolon? Oh, that's why. So I've been wondering why. So IntelliJ has Command-Shift-Enter, which basically completes the current statement, filling in as many closing quotes and close parentheses and semicolons as necessary to complete the statement. It thinks that this semicolon is actually part of my string, so when I do the autocomplete, it sticks it in there. But that semicolon was left over, so now if I do date and do complete, now it works properly. Okay, so that's not a bug in IntelliJ, it's just me being a little careless. Okay, so let's run this test. We should get an error. Basically, the test will fail because date will not have any errors. But this one will, and so that will be good. So, so far we have that the model has errors, that attribute has errors. This one won't. And then the next step will be that we want the page to actually display the error, because right now it's not displaying it. Let's go for a second to the deposit controller. So we renamed this attribute to deposit command, which means, is that going to change the way our tests work? No, because, but we will get a template deposit, but we will get an, the problem is now, because we changed deposit to deposit command, now Thymeleaf is complaining that, hey, what's going on? I can't process this template because it used to be deposit. Yeah, here it is. Yeah, so basically, these error messages, not terribly great. Okay, what we want to do is we actually now want to go to the deposit HTML page, and let's fix that. So before the object was deposit, now it's going to be deposit command, and that should fix it. And this is this is related to the problem we saw before, was because we didn't have model attribute. So actually, I don't think this was a Spring 5 thing. I think this was always the case. So before we had just this, and what happens is Spring will automatically give it a name. The name it will automatically give it is possibly this name if you have debugging on, because it can determine the name of the parameter. In normal situations, it doesn't have that information because that's compiled away. And so we'll call it that. And neither one of those matched the actual attribute on the page. So when we do this, that means that this is the name of the model attribute that we're talking about here. So now that those match, that matches here, I expect now the test to fail for a different reason. So this is useful. I will have to make a note of this, that these need to match. It's kind of funny. I remember running into these problems when I was using struts all those many years ago. If you've never used struts, thank your lucky stars. But trying to figure out which strings matched which other strings and which ones could differ and which ones could be the same was not fun. Okay. So I expect this to fail because the one that I'm checking the errors on actually has no errors. No binding result for amount. Actually, we expected a binding result for amount. I wonder if it's just not fully bound? Because if we look here, we see field error and object on amount. So it's definitely there. That's interesting. Right, it rejected the value, so definitely the error is definitely there. Now I'm really curious because I expected that part of the test to succeed. Right, I expected this attribute to have errors. That's interesting because that should be in the model. So can I put a breakpoint here? Because now like I'm gonna have to look at the docs for this. While I'm looking for the docs for this, let's go and run this test in debug mode and see if we can do a little bit of spelunking. So Spring attribute has errors model. Let's see what we find. So one of the other places, and I keep forgetting to do this myself, one of the other great places to look for sort of documentation information about how to use something, Spring Framework has its own tests, and they're all pretty great. So if we look at its own model assertion tests, what does it do? So these are examples. So we can see exists, the Hamcrest master. So here we expect, so here's like an example. We expect the model, this one, to have errors, so that that case. And if we look at persons for its post mapping, the create, it validates on person with a binding result and the model. Do I need to pass in the model? I don't think so. See, normally I think this is great, except these examples I think are not realistic because here in the post mapping where you'd want to look at the binding result to see errors, which we did, I would want it to do something else besides just return view. So, okay, so let's go back to our code. So we can say model, and we can say, so we know has errors is true. Can we get error count. I don't want error count. Binding result. That's, I kind of want to like, attribute as field. Oh, so I wonder if I'm looking at the wrong thing. So I think what's confusing me is attribute versus field. So deposit command is the attribute, right? Because that's the thing that we put it. So really that attribute is the key in the model map. we actually want to look at the field. So actually we want to say attribute has errors. So it's not amount that has errors, it is deposit command that has errors. So that should evaluate, I guess we can't really evaluate it here because we would have to do an expect. But okay, so I think that's what's going on. All right, that was useful. So it's not attribute has errors, although we could do that. So what we said is the model as a whole has errors. We can be more specific, saying the attribute deposit command has errors, and then we can dive into the specifics. Attribute has field errors, and so here the parameters are the attribute name, which is deposit command, and the field name that we want to look at is amount. So let's turn off the debugging. Let's close the debugging window. Okay, so then this should pass. It's funny, all this information about attributes versus fields and forms is taking a long time to sort of get reloaded into my head because it's been actually a couple of months since I've dived this deeply into this stuff. Now it's all coming back. Okay, and that passes. Great. So now that we have it passing, we have the fact that this basically the model has errors, right? This specific form field, and we can look at that, right? So that's this thing. That's this entire thing, this object. It is a bit confusing because Thymeleaf basically calls this thing an object, whereas in the Spring MVC world, that's basically an attribute. And for me, I always think of attributes as a part of something else. Like if you talk about an object and its attributes, to me, attribute and property mean the same thing. So that's why I was getting confused between the attribute and the actual property. So in Spring MVC, when we put stuff into the model, we add attribute. So attribute here is really the object, and then the field is a property of that object. This is why naming is so important, and I harp on this with my coaching clients. When I coach folks, it's like if this were sort of a project that one person or one team or one group was in charge of, I'd say you need to make these consistent because this will confuse people. I've seen teams use one term one place and then another term another place, and that's just really bad. And that's one of the great things about domain-driven design is it really brings up front the fact that you want to have consistent naming with what's called ubiquitous language. Okay. So let's now look. So our deposit form. So now what we want to do is now we can look at the Thymeleaf stuff. Let's close this. Actually, I'm going to keep this open because I don't think this is a good example, and I'd like to file a PR on that. This was useful, so I'm going to pocket this page. And then we'll go back to the Thymeleaf docs. And so we want to show our field errors. So what do we want to do? We want to display that. Right now, let's just display the message. And actually, we can use my example. So here we have, we can add a span tag with if and the errors. We'll look at CSS error classes later. So what we can do is, as part of the field, we can add this if, the Thymeleaf if thing. Yeah, so let's do that. And we'll go into, oh, we're already on our form. And we want to display something inside of this label. Not sure the formatting will be quite what we want. So not the friendliest error message, but that's okay. So our field name here is amount. So what'll happen is at runtime, if has errors amount, then it will display the errors. This is actually a placeholder. So we'll see what this gets displayed as. Okay, so now we can restart our application. And while that's starting, we can think about the test that I'd want to test for this message. See, this is at the point where I'm like, do I want to have a test at the level of basically the UI, right? So basically the generation of this template. And I've been sort of avoiding those, but it might be time to add in a couple of those. All right, so let's go, oops, not here. Let's go back to here. Login, parent. So let's go ahead and deposit money, and we want to try to deposit -100. So not the friendliest display, but you can see that the default error messages must be greater than 0. And what's interesting, though, is we seem to have lost our account balance. Because that's in a separate attribute that is, oh, okay, we'll have to fix that. So notice that there is no account balance here because the text here, and actually we could look at the view page source. We'll see that basically that span is empty. We can't look at the page source. How about we inspect element? Post. So we can look at our header and we can see that this H1, which is where the balance is supposed to be, right? That's this part. It's pulling balance as a separate attribute, but because we, in our controller, the only thing that gets passed along is just this one. So up here, this was never added back to the model. So there are a couple ways to fix this. I'm not going to worry about this right now. One option is to put more information in the command, and that might actually help us because there are several places where we have this redundant code of getting the balance and adding it. And we could put that inside of a larger object and always create that. But for now, it's just a bug that I need to fix. So let us file a bug against ourselves. I might have to split bugs and tasks. I want to copy list. Let's go ahead and add another list. Bugs. Let's move this over. See, here's that create Thymeleaf fragment for account balance view that's currently duplicated across controls. This is what I was just mentioning. None of these are bugs, so then let's rename this. This is just tasks. These are bugs. Account balance isn't displayed when submitting form with an error, because balance attribute isn't put into the model. That's used when there are errors. Okay. So let's now look at our code. All right. So so if we have an error, we'll fix that. We'll have to write it. We'll write a failing test for that, and we'll fix it at some point. Right now, what we're looking at is we want to display the error. That's not terribly friendly. We could, what was it? We could style it more nicely if there were errors. Where's the end? Here it is. We could actually put this as a div and see what that looks like. So let's do that. So deposit 8 of 100. Okay. So at least now we see that this is the error that we're getting. There's some CSS improvements that I forgot to make yesterday to make this nicer. But now we get the error message. Now you might be wondering, where does this error message get created? That gets created as part of the core validation. So one of the things that we see when we ran this test, actually won't see it because this has passed. As a byproduct of the valid, when we positive by itself, when it fails, it generates its own message. And so you could look at, I don't know where that message is stored. Here it is. So we could define our own message. By default, it pulls it from JavaX validation constraints, pulls it from somewhere. So we could actually override that message. Over here, we can say message equals amount must be greater than 0. You can do that. And so now, instead of must be greater than 0, where it's like, oh, at least it's a little bit friendlier. Say amount, but must be more than $0 and format it like that or something. This is obviously something that we could even pull out into configuration if we wanted to, but for now we could do that. And then if we rebuild, so the application is restarting. So one thing you'll notice is this dialog. What I did is I wanted to refresh the page, and it's basically saying, in order for me to refresh this page, I'm going to need to repost the form. Is that what you want to do? And so there's a pattern called post redirect get that gets around this problem, no pun intended, where, and I think that's actually the way we're going to fix the fact that account balance isn't there. So let's cancel that. We'll just make a note here. Use post redirect get to fix. So I think that will fix it. And let's go back to here. Deposit minus 100. And so this is a friendlier error message. Okay, we could assert this message in our test. I don't feel the need to do that. Okay, so we've done this for deposit. We should now do the same thing for the spend command. So we can go into our spend controller. And pretty much this will be the same thing. So if we go into our deposit controller, we see that what we did was we added the @valid and the @model attribute. We should make these two consistent just like we did here in the deposit command. So we can take this part and put it in our spend controller. And this should be spend command. So that way when we put this here, this is spend command. And this should return spend. What's the problem? Make method void. Why would I do that? Okay. Spend command. Oops. That's what I get with copy and paste. Okay. Because I copied and pasted this, there's a part of me that's thinking I might want some hierarchy of things, but I don't know. I have probably an overdeveloped fear. I don't know if fear is the right word, but bias against anything that involves inheritance hierarchies. But this might be something to do here, where the validation part feels like something that I could pull out separately. The other part is, and this maybe it's not. So what I'm talking about is there's two things going on in this method. There is the top part that is dealing with adapter level user facing or external facing error messages, right? Is the incoming information valid? If not, reject it in some way. Then there's this part, which is really this part, which is domain level, which is do the thing, right? Execute the command. I've been calling this command, although if you think about the command pattern, this is not the command pattern. This is just, I call it command because I'm thinking that eventually it'll be a command pattern. And so then the contents of this will just be command execute. And once you get there, then we'll see that what's really being pulled out is this core that's the domain, and then the process spend versus the process deposit are exactly the same, other than what's really the command part, right? This part. And so if I extract that out, then I can use the same controller mechanism for both the processing deposit and for processing spending. Now, that works because they currently are sharing the transaction command. But if I do something different on the deposit form versus the spend form, they might differ, and I might have to have different command objects. So that's sort of why it just so happens that they coincide and that I can reuse these two commands, but they might differ at some point. But that's a potential refactoring that I might want to do. Okay. Let's take a break. What I'm going to do during the break is I'm going to kick off all the tests, because I think all the tests, I shouldn't have broken anything, right? Because all we've done is we've taken the validation that we had on the object. They're now displayed in the form. Yes, the forms are a little ugly looking, but functionally it is fine. So let's go and run all our tests. And when we come back from the break, we'll see what we want to do next. So as you can see, we've got a few failing tests. One of them, the one that's highlighted right now, this null pointer exception. Remember I said we'd run into a null pointer exception? Well, here it is. So this is because in our deposit controller test, remember we passed in null because the process deposit command now takes a binding result. But in our process, we actually examine we do binding result has errors. When we're running within Spring, binding result is guaranteed to not be null. Spring will not give you a null binding result. However, our test is passing in null, and so we get a null pointer exception. So what we need to do instead is binding result. So the question is, can we instantiate this directly? Not bind result, binding result. New. Well, that was weird. New binding result. Yeah, so this thing is not easily instantiated, so that's not going to work. Because I guess binding result is an interface, right? Yeah, it's an interface. So do we have something in binding result utils? I guess I could create a mock for this. So what does this method do? Get binding result for the given name and the given model. Returns the binding result or null if not found. So that's not useful. This one might be useful. Basically, it returns the binding result, which is never null. So I wonder what that looks like. Because if I can't use that one, so it looks like this. Ah, damn it. Dang it. Get binding result. If binding result is null. Well, okay, that's misleading, right? Because the Java doc said it will never return null. It's like, yeah, of course not, because it will throw an exception. So that's not terribly helpful. So what does this method look like? I don't see the difference between the two. That's really unfortunate. Okay, so it pulls it from the model. We don't have a model. All right, so I guess we will have to mock this. Mock binding result. So create a field, say mock. Would this be a mock beam? What is up with you, IntelliJ? So what we want to do is we want to have basically a dummy. No, actually, in this case, it is a stub. So a stub basically returns a hard-coded value. We want it to always return the fact that has errors is false. Yeah, I think we just want to mock. And so what we want to do is given see, this shows you how rarely I actually use Mockito. So now I need to find an example of mocking this stuff. An example here. mock binding result. This might be useful. Oh, that's interesting. So they manually create one here. They have one that has Makito binding results. Let's take a look at that one. Nope. So let's see. Oh, okay. Duh. So what I want is I want mock. Well, I created the mock. Okay, what I forget. What does mock do? So once I have that, what does stub only do? That's interesting. Stub only. What does that mean? So I guess it's good that I don't use mocks very often, but it means when I do need to use them. See, I think they don't mean stub. I actually think they mean dummy, but all right. So what was it? So stub only means that it doesn't record method invocation, so you can't do any confirmation that methods were called, but it disallows, so you can't verify invocations, but it will allow verifications to be called. That might be good enough. I'm curious if that's good enough. So if we set stub only to be true, what happens when we run this test? Did it just not do anything? Should have created a mock. All right, let's look at Spring test mock. All right, so I guess we would just use when. We don't need, we're not dealing with any bean that we need to be concerned about, so we can just use when. Okay, then stub only is true is okay because we don't really want to verify anything. So let's do when when so when yeah, so when mock binding result dot has errors, then return false. Okay. As I said, I don't use mocking very often, so I completely forget what the syntax is. So what we're saying here, and I wonder if there's a shorter way to do this, but this will be good enough. And we can copy this and go over to our spend controller test class and mock binding result and create mock. So binding result, mock binding result, that's a mock. Okay, so let's run the test again. It should pass or not. Is it not creating the mock? Oh, okay. Because I don't have the annotation, that's why. That would help. So do I want to even bother with the annotation? I'm already doing Makito when. I could just mock it up directly. Sure, why not? So let's do that. So now I wonder if that using the stub only. So here again is like when I saw the null pointer exception before, I assumed that there was something wrong with the mocking, but it was really that I didn't have the run with. So I wonder if I can use the stub only equals true, whether that will work. So let's see. All right, so let's run this test. This should pass because we have a mock that is dedicated to returning false. Okay, so now I'm wondering if we don't even bother with this, what happens? Does it still return false? If we say stub only equals true, what happens? And that passes. I kind of feel like that's not as clear. So, but we can leave the stub only equals true because we don't care about verifying that has errors was called. Okay, so that one works. In our deposit controller test, we need to tack on that. Got our mock, saying when it returns false. Okay, so let's run all our unit tests. So let's run pretty quickly because there were 4 tests that were failing, and I want to see what the other ones were. Okay, so all the unit tests pass, and so that means we have some integration tests that were failing. I wonder if they're still failing. So let's run our integration tests. And while that's happening, let's take a look at the spend form, because in the deposit form we added, we changed the deposit form so that we had deposit command. Remember, we changed spend to spend command, and I think we didn't update the form. let's, so I bet that's what will fail. We'll go here. Yeah, so this should be spend command. And we'll want in here the error message. And that's this, yeah, suspend because we changed spend command. So that was the failure there. I'll let these finish and then we'll rerun the tests and these should all pass. So that one failed. This one's still running. What else? We have that bug, our security config. So yeah, we figured out the logout stuff was the CSRF. So we want to enable. I want to remember to enable that. I think I have that as a task. I'm going to consider this a bug because it's more, sort of not just a task, but it's a bug that we don't have this. Okay, so we have two failing tests. We have this one and this one. Why is this one failing? Oh, we changed the attribute name in our test. So this should be attribute exists both balance and deposit command. Right. Do we have one for spend one? And this should be spend command. Okay, so let's rerun just the failing tests. And I think we're good. Then we'll commit and so those are running. What's next on our agenda? So we'll consider input validation to be done. The only question is when we do a deposit or a spend, do we want to enforce that there's a source? Do we want to also enforce that this date is not in the future? We could do that. Trying to think if there's any user reason why I'd want to put in a deposit in the future. So I can certainly think of cases where I want automatic deposits to happen, but I don't think I want anyone actually manually creating a deposit or spending money that's in the future. Certainly not depositing it. No, I don't think I want any date in the future. If we come to a point where a user asks for they want to deposit or spend in the future, then we can relax that constraint, but we should have a constraint on our transaction command that the date can't be in the future. So here's another case where we get it as a string, but we need to convert it into a date. Now, we can't rely on Spring to do the conversion for us because we had to convert it from a specific format. And oh, our test passed, so that's good. Let's do a commit. And this is episode 17, input validation with form errors. So we currently validate that the amount is always greater than 0. And amounts 0 or less than 0 are rejected with an error message. This all looks good. I won't push it yet. Okay. And now, so validation. So here we kind of need to do a custom validation, right? We can't really validate against this date because it's a string, and the conversion happens using basically our custom conversion. So this is interesting. So how would we create a custom validation? I don't think my labs go that deep. So we could look at the Hibernate validator reference. That's interesting. What version of the validator are we currently using? I have no idea. We could look. So this, that's a validation constraints. I wonder if we have, if it displays anything in the test. So let's go and look at our dependencies. So Hibernate validator. Oh, okay. So we are using 6. Cool. Using 6014. Ooh, they changed the docs. Looks like ASCII doc. So declaring field level constraints, property level constraints. I wonder if we can do a property level constraint. So the difference between a field level constraint and a property level constraint, this is a field level constraint, right? The constraint is on the field. What we want is we want basically a constraint against this thing. So is this considered a property? It doesn't follow the getter, so it's not really a property. I wonder, do I have to abide by... Does it really care that it doesn't follow the setter getter naming convention? So the assumption is that your properties have getters and setters, but can we... I mean, I don't feel like if I had to change this to get date as local time, I don't feel that strongly about it. But I wonder if I can do that. Can I say, so not that valid. So this would be date, what is it? Future. Actually it's past or present. Right, so this annotation basically says, God, what is up with the way? So this one basically says the annotated element must be an instant date or time, and it must be in the past or in the present. And it uses the current clock provider attached to the validator factory. So date, calendar, local date time. So this should work because we're returning a local date time. We could write a test to see if this works. Okay, so let's go to our, let's close this. So let's go to our, where's our test? So we have our transaction command validation test. Okay. Let's close this window. Let's stop the app. So these are dealing with amounts. Let's go ahead and create one that tests the date. So date, sure, date in future should not be valid. So we'll create a transaction command. And we'll set the date. And we need this date to be in that browser format. So I need to remind myself what that is. That's here. So that's YYMMDD, which is this thing. So it's this format. It's 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day. So we want this to be in the future. Now, one thing that'll be important, I won't put it in right away, but for consistency, remember the validation documentation talked about a clock provider, right? So when you're dealing with dates, you need to fix the clock, otherwise you won't be able to test it. So let's go into our test. So it was year, year, month, month, 4-digit year. So date and future. Well, certainly 21 is in the future. 2100 is in the future. And we'll do February 3rd, 12th. What the heck? Okay. Now, when we ask it to validate, so we'll do our validation. We expect that the constraint violations we expect this to have a size of 1, right? So we expect 1. Sorry, I'm just thinking we might get a validation because amount is sort of null. So let's make sure that amount is valid. Okay, so we should only get 1. So this is valid and this is invalid. So this is certainly a date in the future. When we ask it to validate it, we should get just the 1 constraint violation, which is that the date is in the future. So let's see if this works. I would assume it would, because all it's going to do is look for those things that are annotated and just call those methods. Aw. So it failed because there were none. I wonder, so I did see like you're not supposed to mix these. Properties getter has to be annotated. When using property level constraints, property access strategy is used to access the value. That is, it accesses the state via the property access method. It's recommended is not recommended and accompanying. Well, I'm not concerned about, so this is saying that don't annotate both. Well, I'm not annotating both. If your model, it's also possible to annotate the properties. Okay, so property level constraints. So I wonder if it has to be a getter. Well, what we could do is temporarily create a getDate method. See, this data annotation is already generating getters and setters. So it generates getters for all fields and other stuff. So basically it adds getters, setters, and arg constructor and so on. So there's already a getDate method. Pomodoro is finished. I'll ignore that because we're almost at our stop time for today. So what if we, instead of trying to annotate this method, where is this used? Can I just rename this? Okay, so this is used in the 2 controllers. So what if I just rename this to be a getter? So it's get date as local date time. So does that fix it? Because what it's probably using is, so there's JavaBeans code, right? That goes way back to the early days of Java. Okay, so it's using the JavaBeans code to extract getters and setters, and so it must abide by the naming convention in order to apply it. That's okay. That's not horrible. This is a DTO, so I'm not concerned about having get methods on it. And so now let's make sure that it failed for the, we should have had it failing for the right reasons. Let's go back to our validation test. This is certainly valid. So this should now fail because that is in the present or past. Okay. I think we've got this reversed because, no, that's right. So basically, the validations were empty. Okay. So that means if we have a date that's in the future, it's invalid. We expect it to have 1 constraint violation, which it did. We could look deeper into the constraint violation itself, but I don't feel the need to do that. Check that. Maybe I should do that. So what is it? Get next. So constraint violations is a set. I guess I can get an iterator next. Gives us a constraint violation. What I'd like to know is it on the correct property. And so that would be the property path? What does unwrap do? No. So so I can get the invalid value. And I can assert that the invalid value can I cast this? So I should be able to pass this, sorry, cast this as a local date time. So I'll have to cast that. And so we can assert that the invalid value is equal to ignoring hours? What does this do? It basically doesn't care about the hours. Same year, month, and day fields. Right, so that's what I want. And basically local date time of 2100 to 12, and these don't matter. Okay. So what we're saying here is that not only did we get a constraint violation, but the one that was invalid, we're basically casting to a local date time because that's our assumption it's a date time, and that it's this one. This might be a bit overmuch. We could actually just validate that the invalid value is just of type local date time. That might be easier. So assert that, so we don't even bother casting it. So delete that, get invalid value. So we'll sort of uncast this. This is an object. So we can now just assert that the invalid value is instance of local date time. Okay, so let's run this now. So we're being a bit more specific about not just that we expect a violation error, but that the single violation error that we get is a local date time, and it is. I'm uncomfortable with a test that's never failed, so let's make this test first. Make this fail first, so we'll just say it's, I don't know, string, and run it again. Basically, going by, and somebody had tweeted this at some point, basically a test that never fails doesn't provide you any value because you don't know that it's testing the right thing. Okay, and it's failed because it expected it to be a local date time, which is what it is. Okay, we could do the same thing here. I wonder if these are going to... So now let's run all these tests. I think these other ones might fail because date is basically empty, and that will cause those to fail. Yeah, okay. Basically unable to access get date as local date time. Okay, so let's, instead of this one, we can use the transaction command create with today date. And that should make these pass. So that one, and that one. So let's run those again. And now those all pass. Great. And so we could be more specific here. We could do something similar where we can assert that the invalid value is of that certain type. And in this case, it's not going to be the date time that's invalid, but the amount which is a big decimal, right? Yes. So we'll change this to big decimal. And could do the same thing here. And now we run all the tests again, and now they should all pass. Great. All right. So we've now, is there the only other input that's happening against the transaction command is the source or the description. I'm not going to basically require any validation there. So we have validation on the date, but we haven't put anything into the form itself. But that's pretty much just more of the same that we did for the amount. So what I'm going to basically do is, it's now 1 o'clock my time. That's the end of my time allotted for this stream. And what we'll do next, so I'll go ahead and I won't commit this yet because I want to put in, and I'm not going to do it right now. I want to put in the form, basically an error message for date, and basically make this form look a little bit more modern. But we can pretty much consider the input validation just about done. And so what we'll do for tomorrow is I want to go back to our SMS stuff and do a couple of things. One is, so far it's been responding to an SMS request coming in. So basically if I text in a message saying balance and it's of a known phone number, it will respond back with the current balance. We currently have now login, and so now we can start associating a phone number profile with the account. So instead of verifying that the phone number that's sending the text message is known up front, we can put that as part of the profile. Then we can go ahead and send out a text message when the balance changes. And so we'll continue to use Twilio for that. Twilio has kudos to them. They've provided actually a coupon so that if you want to use Twilio for your own stuff, it's $20 of credit, and it's just the code JitterTed, and I'll mention that again next time. And they also gave me some credit so I can play around with it. So thanks to Twilio for that. Again, hit me up on Twitter or elsewhere, and I will see you tomorrow. All right, have a good one.